While carefully studying the Ukraine war, how will the Chinese Communist Party military optimize its attack against Taiwan? And what should America do to help equip this frontline nation to defend against the biggest threat to America's existence? In the second part of our two-part interview, Colonel Grant Newsham and I talk about what the United States and its allies should do to break Taiwan out of isolation, and how Taiwan can better defend against the prospective attack from the Chinese Communist Party. Welcome back, Colonel.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be here again.
So yesterday we talked about the grand scale changes in the Western Pacific and the kind of the different power struggles and the potential interest points in this region that's strategically very important to the United States. But of course, one relevant question is the question of Taiwan. The CCP has been studying in the Ukraine war, likely will optimize its attack against Taiwan. In your point of view, how do you think the PLA will do this?
Well, I think the Chinese military and, more importantly, the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping et al., they're going to recalculate based on what they've seen happen in Ukraine. I think that they had the same sort of optimistic or overly optimistic expectations of what would happen in Ukraine that Vladimir Putin had. Specifically, they thought this was going to be a very quick fight, a very quick victory, maybe 3-4 days, very quick. There might be a little complaining from the democracies of the world, but nothing much. And there wouldn't really be any serious economic sanctions put on anybody. And everything would go back to normal. People, the free world would forget about what had happened to Ukraine. That obviously didn't happen. So the Chinese must be watching that very closely and considering, well, if it didn't work for Ukraine, what's going to happen if we expect the same thing to happen to Taiwan? Maybe not. So the Chinese military and the leadership, I think, will go back to the drawing board. I think they are still just as serious about trying to take Taiwan, to seize Taiwan. They haven't given up on that at all. But the actual way they go about it, I think they will look at what happened in Ukraine and try to address what look like shortcomings in the Russian method of operations. And that's what I would expect. The idea was that, with the Russians thought, well, if you just hit Ukraine hard, if you can get rid of the leadership and move some troops in, that it would just cause the whole thing to collapse. That didn't happen. And now there is real concern that maybe that if the Taiwanese fight, maybe if Taiwan's leadership does not surrender or run away, but rather sticks around and rallies people, rallies the public, rallies the military, well, maybe that's going to be a bigger problem than the Beijing expected. So they're going to be rethinking this whole thing. And I think it's probably going to put their timelines off a bit. But I would stress that the Chinese leadership is indeed serious when they say they are going to take Taiwan.
And do you think there will be a change in the military, perspective in terms of the strategies? For example, would they lean heavier towards, cutting off Taiwan's communication systems, or any kind of changes in the operation sphere that you see from this point?
I would expect so. I think particularly on the electronic end, I think there would be an effort to completely cut Taiwan off from the internet, for want of a better word, to completely shut down their electronics, to completely blockade the country. There would also be, I think, an effort to hit Taiwan much harder than the Russians hit Ukraine. And when I hit them, that was with particularly missiles, airstrikes, etc. Even the Chinese Navy gets into the mix. The Chinese probably look at what the Russians did and they think, well, the Russians didn't do it hard enough. They weren't tough enough. So if we go after Taiwan, we're really going to hit them hard, and we are going to try to blockade them as well. And that is, I think, part of the Chinese thinking. Additionally, they will try to sanctions-proof themselves. So even if the Americans and the Europeans put sanctions on China, that the Chinese will try to be able to ride that out and to, say, withstand it. So they're looking at, I think, looking at the Russian experience and saying, well, what would we need to do differently in Taiwan? The Chinese also really must be wondering whether or not their political warfare, their subversion efforts in Taiwan have been all that effective, because so much of, say, Taiwan's academia, even the political world, the media, has been subverted by China and Chinese money. That China must be wondering if whether their expectations that this fifth column would be really helpful in the event of an attack on Taiwan. They must be wondering about that. So I would expect them to redouble their subversion efforts as well. But the good thing is that if you're looking at it from Taiwan's perspective, from the US's perspective, that you can actually see and you can kind of figure out what the Chinese game is going to be, what their approach to attacking Taiwan based on Ukraine lessons learned. You can see what it's probably going to look like, which means you know how to protect and prepare for it. And you also know how to cause the Chinese some problems that will make things difficult for them if they do go after Taiwan. So both sides learn from what has happened in Ukraine. It's not as if the Chinese are the only ones who see the sort of the things to be changed, the things to be improved. The Taiwanese can see it just as well. So can the Americans.
For sure. And, I want to go into exactly that question. So how can the United States help Taiwan develop any of these military capabilities, from the civil-military fusion, asymmetric warfare, or the multi-layered defense that essentially that we're witnessing in Ukraine right now?
Well, the first thing that the Americans could do and should do, in my opinion, that would really have some effect is to break Taiwan out of its 40 plus years of isolation. The Taiwanese military has had almost no connection with foreign militaries, including the Americans, for the last 40 plus years. As a result, it has not been able to develop the way that it needs to develop in terms of operational capabilities and know-how. And also, there's a psychological aspect to this. Suppose you're supposed to defend the country against this powerful enemy, and your best friends, the Americans, don't even want to be seen in public with you. And yes, there are some meetings which take place and some visits in both directions. But the key thing is the Americans still will not do joint training, joint exercises with the Taiwan military. So the Taiwan military is like this baseball team that never gets to actually play a game. And you can see that it has not developed the way that it needs to do. If America is serious and they want to really help Taiwan, the first thing you do is break that isolation. And if you do that, you will find that the Chinese military's capabilities improve, that it's psychologically it's beneficial. And you also see that the Taiwanese citizenry, the public, and the government will also get sort of energized by the fact that the Americans are willing to incur some criticism from the Chinese, from the communist Chinese, by getting involved with the Taiwan military. So one thing that I would like to see happen would be something like the establishment of a Central Pacific Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Relief Force that combines U.S. Marines, the U.S. Navy, with the Taiwan Navy and the Taiwan Marine Corps. You set up a small headquarters in Taiwan where you train for HADR, so the Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Relief operations, and you go out, say, to Guam, Saipan, and you conduct exercises. You might even get the Japanese to join in, conduct exercises, and when tsunamis and earthquakes actually hit in the region, as they do, well, the Americans and the Taiwanese get out and go operate together. But if you're not willing to break that isolation, that you've really hamstrung the Taiwanese and their ability to defend themselves. But there's too much of the approach seems to be, well, if they buy long-range missiles, anti-aircraft systems, that the so-called asymmetric approach to defense, that alone is going to be enough. You've got to do more. Those are important weapons to have, and knowing how to use them and employ them properly, that would be that it's essential. But as I said, if you don't break that isolation, then just pouring in hardware and hoping that the that the Taiwanese will fight like tigers when the Chinese come. That isn't enough. We need to do a lot more of that. And I would like to see, for example, U.S. advisors and trainers in Taiwan in larger numbers. Once again, helping the Taiwanese develop these skills, the ability to put on sort of this asymmetric defense. And it's also a defense that can reach out to the Chinese coast. These anti-ship missiles, for example, that they go all the way to the other side of the Taiwan Strait, and they can crack a ship in half. So you might find that the Chinese Navy runs out of ships before the Taiwanese run out of anti-ship missiles. And you also make it so that if any People's Liberation Army forces get ashore, that they have a very hard time, that they wish they didn't come. So there's a couple things that I really think the Americans need to do. But first, it has to start with breaking Taiwan's 40 plus years of isolation. If you do that, Taiwan's military prospects will improve. And also, you've got to get the Americans actually talking to the Taiwanese about joint defense and figuring out how to bring this about, and also training for it. That's an essential thing, as they get those trainers in as well. It would also be good to see the Americans give Taiwan a free trade agreement, bolster the Taiwanese economy. And that has a political effect, and it also manifests itself in improved confidence throughout society. And you'd also find the Taiwan military would improve as well as a result of that. But also the Taiwan government has to treat the military as a valued resource, treat it with some respect. I talked about how poorly the Japanese troops are treated. It's even worse in Taiwan. That you've got to, once again, make it a respected profession. And unless you're willing to spend money, that you can say you respect it all you want, but you're not serious. But that is absolutely essential, is you've got to get the personnel end right. And the Taiwan military has lost too many good officers in recent years because of this lack of respect, the lack of resourcing. And also, the Taiwan military would probably do well to actually, let's say, improve some of its concepts of operation, some of which look like they're from 30, 40 years ago. Once again, that goes back to the question of this isolation, which has prevented the Taiwan military from developing the way it needs to. But the Americans have done a very good job. I'm being a little mean, but I've seen too many groups of American academics, former officials, think tankers. They cycle through Taiwan, and all they do is complain. They say, well, you've got to have asymmetric warfare. Be asymmetric, be asymmetric. You've got to spend more money, spend more money. And the Taiwanese are the politest people on earth, so they just smile. But they're thinking, well, wouldn't you let us train with you a little bit? How about that? And successive American administrations have been very grudging about what they've sold Taiwan. One can't overlook that. That they've really been tight on the types of equipment they've sold, the amounts of it. And the idea almost seems to be, well, the Americans know best what the Taiwanese need. And, well, I would suggest the Americans do not know best what the Taiwanese need. They're the ones who are going to have to do most of the fighting and the dying. We can help them. We can offer advice. But we have not done very good in giving Taiwan the hardware that it needs to date. Maybe that's loosening up a bit, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So those to say just a few observations, but say after you watch this long enough and you can get kind of disappointed at what the free world has not done really to support this democracy on Taiwan, which is 24 million free people who've shown that, well, people of Chinese origin can indeed live under a democracy with a free press and individual liberties. They do all the things that the Chinese Communist Party says cannot be done. And the Chinese Communist argument seems to be that, well, without a boot on the neck, Chinese people cannot be governed. Taiwan is proof that that's a lie.
And to your point, some would argue that one reason that Ukraine was so successful in defending against Russia, at least militarily, it's its high level of integration with the Western military and weapon systems. This, and as you mentioned, this isn't really the case in Taiwan. But a parallel issue to that, and as you have also mentioned, is that Chinese Communist Party has been infiltrating, arguably successfully, parts of Taiwan's political structure through its United Front work. Do you see a concern from the U.S. perspective with assisting Taiwan in building up its military and offering the know-hows in that case, with the military technology and resources? Do you see a risk of U.S. military technology being leaked to China if the U.S. does that?
Oh, that's always a risk. Chinese espionage is it's what they do, and they're often very good at it. So that's a risk when you deal with any ally, any partner. What you do, of course, is ways around it. Is you don't you're careful what you give. You have to if there's something that you really don't want to lose, then you either don't give it or you um, pass it along in a way that you know how it's going to be used and that it's going to be used securely, etc. Uh, Also, the Taiwanese have to get their own counterintelligence uh, operations in order. That's been a very weak point in Taiwan for a long time. There haven't been really a sort of a classification scheme that restricts how information is parceled out to people so that they only have see what they have a need to know and that they've been vetted, etc. And the laws governing espionage have been really weak in Taiwan. The penalties for getting caught are just, we look at them and we say, is that all? And Taiwanese know that. They know this needs corrected. So encourage and help the Taiwanese get a better handle on classified information. The Japanese have a similar problem, actually, and so do some of our other allies. But nonetheless, there's plenty of things that you can give that do not pose a huge threat, say from technology loss, etc. And a lot of the issue, of course, is how do you employ these weapons and these operating concepts? These are not all that secret. That these are things that any competent military is going to figure out, going to know how to do it, and that's an area where we can be very helpful to Taiwan. Is we do have a lot of experience at a lot of the small unit operations that can give say an invader like the Taiwanese all the trouble they can handle, and that once again there's not a technology or an espionage aspect to that, unless it's somebody, say you've got a spy in the Taiwanese military who's handing over your defense plans. But there's plenty you can do despite the concerns which you've mentioned. And I think the biggest restraint actually on what America has done or not done to support Taiwan has been the fear of China complaining. You will often hear, well, the Chinese won't like it. China will complain. China will be unhappy. It will be nice for once to see the Chinese actually saying, well, the Americans won't like it. The Americans will be unhappy. I don't think the Chinese ever think that, but we tend to think it on their behalf for them. And that probably has been the biggest restraint on American and free world support for Taiwan, is fear of upsetting China. In some respects, it's the concern of losing access to the China market. And once again, I mentioned earlier that yesterday this addiction to Chinese money that plays out on the political and the military front. Got to get a handle on that and do it quickly.
And I want to finish up with a question on the National Defense Strategy, which was set to be released soon. I think it was supposed to be released in early 2022, a little bit before now. But as we're having this conversation, it hasn't been released. Do you expect, with the current administration, a higher lean towards countering the China threat, or do you think that this will, by China will sort of be a part of a spectrum of threats, which means that they're not really prioritized as the very first threat in America?
Oh, I think China will get the attention it deserves and the priority it deserves in the defense strategy whenever it appears. But as you can see, that I guess real events kind of interfere, and what's going on in Ukraine with the Russians is an immediate problem and a really serious one. Then you've got Iran. So the defense strategy is going to have to look at the entire map. China will get priority. But as a practical matter, America finds itself having to deal with at least two major problems at the same time. And if you throw North Korea into that, which would be operating really as a supporting effort on behalf of whatever the Chinese do, that America's got its work cut out for it. I remember 30 years, whenever that was, that I thought it was the end of history and that the democracy had won. Looks like it hasn't quite come to pass. So whenever the strategy comes out, I suspect it'll be well written and it will say the right things, but translating the right things into actual military, diplomatic, political, there's capabilities, really the ability of the America to sort of employ all the force, all the power at its disposal, not just the military part, and to deploy it in an effective, coordinated way with its allies. That's always the hard part. You see, writing these strategies is actually really easy. It's surprising it takes so long. But actually getting stuff done in the real world, well, that's a challenge for everybody. One did you sort of marvel at just how much the Trump administration did get done just in the 3 years or so that it had to really operate. And that was the result of having some very good people handling Asia Pacific and national security affairs as well.
Right, and because it kind of really deviated in many sense in its Indo-Pacific strategy from, or referring to the Trump administration, from the previous administration. So it had to come up with this new thing that works, and that works in a very short amount of time. So I think that's, to your point, that's that's what you're referring to, right?
Well, yes, but also they had a fundamental shift in psychology in D.C. for an administration, and it was that it was going to say no to China, and it was going to promote American interests, and it was going to recognize China as an adversary, if not an enemy, and it was going to push back. So America finally got up on its hind legs, kind of, and that was just a fundamental change. No previous administration had been willing to say that China was an adversary or an enemy, or to admit China's objectives, which are to drive the Americans out of the Asia-Pacific region and indeed to dominate the entire globe. The Trump administration had some people who understood this, and they made it policy, and they tried to do something about it. Say that's the first time any administration, really since Nixon, has actually done that. And that was really all you needed to do, was to recognize that the People's Republic of China is a threat. And it's amazing that it took that long. And we'll see if the Biden administration can carry on with that. One hopes, and as with any administration, one hopes that it succeeds. And that is the key thing. As an American, we all want an administration to succeed in its foreign policy. We may see things differently, but success is the key thing, and we all support what they do. But if there's something we see that we would do differently, well, we say so.
Well, I'm glad we're able to finish on a high note. Colonel, thanks so much for your time today.
Pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few ideas.